So welcome everyone. It's a great honor for Transition Putney to bring here to Brattleboro and the region Michael Schumann. And Ellen Lovell is going to introduce him in just a moment. I just wanted to say a few words. Michael's been out in Putney. He's already done 3 events in Putney in the last, how many hours? 12 hours, something like that. And very well received. His message is very consistent with the transition movement. It's all about building resilience in our communities, and it's all about localizing our economies. Very exciting, very practical approach, which we've been thrilled to hear. Let's see, what else can I say? Other than thank you to all of the co-sponsors for this event. Marlborough College Graduate School is one of those co-sponsors, and there's 5 other sponsors in Putney. Enjoy your lunch. We are going to start with Ellen, and then Michael's going to speak for about 20 minutes. Then we will have a panel of 5 people who are representing different sectors of the economy here in Brattleboro. Those panel members will speak for 5 minutes each, and then after that, Michael will respond and engage us all in a conversation. So thank you, and I'm going to turn this over to Ellen.
Thank you very much. I want to offer a brief welcome from Marlborough College and the Marlborough College Graduate School. You are in the graduate school building, and we are a really vital part of Brattleboro and Windham County and the region. And so when Paul contacted me, it seemed to me that the subject of this conference was exactly consonant with our purposes and the reason why Marlborough College created the graduate school about 14 years ago. For those of you who don't know, the college was founded about 65 years ago as a liberal arts college in Marlborough. And it's a small teaching intensive model. And that model traveled to downtown Brattleboro. And it is here where we attract adult students who are getting continuing education or graduate degrees. So we're very, very proud to be a co-sponsor. I want to thank John Burt for the inspiration, and Paul as well, and Michael Schumann for coming to Vermont. And I know that this is a subject of very vital interest to all of us. I'm impressed with the turnout and what I just heard about all the events that have happened over the last couple of days. So, Michael, I think you are here at exactly the right time. Your work in rural development, I think, fits our community, county, and state values very precisely. You've written and spoken widely about it, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you today. Then we're going to have a panel discussion with some brief comments from each of the panelists, from the chairs, and the emphasis will be on discussion. So I hope as your moderator to keep it interactive and to give you some more information about the county and its potential, but also seek your ideas and answer your questions. A warm welcome to you, Michael Schumann.
Very good. So by show of hands, how many people were at last night's talk or this morning's breakfast? Okay. So you folks are going to hear a couple of things again. Apologies. Also by show of hands, how many of you are small business people? Outstanding. How many of you would call yourselves policy makers or economic developers or something in that genre? Okay. And how many of you would call yourselves social activists? All right, so we've got a good mix here today. I'm sure I missed some categories, you know, ex-felons and the like. We'll come to those. What I'm going to try to do in 20 minutes or fewer, I've got my eye on the clock to keep me to that, is the Cliff Note version of what I said last night in about an hour and 15 minutes. And I deliberately am not using any slides because sometimes slides prevent you from actually moving through the material rapidly enough when only there's a short amount of time. A lot of the work that I've been doing lately has been focused on delivering news about what works and what doesn't work in economic development. And this is an area where there's been a huge amount of research and activity on the ground in the last few years. And unfortunately, the only people who don't quite realize what's happening are much of the economic development profession. And we're here to sort of correct that record. Most of economic development today is focused on attraction or retention of non-local business. I just finished a study for the Kellogg Foundation where I looked at the 3 largest economic development programs in 15 US states. And what we found was that 80% of the dollars are, 80% of the programs rather, are spending most of their money on non-local outside business. And 30% of the programs are spending 90% of their money on attraction or retention of non-local business. There is another approach to economic development that I call LOIS. And LOIS stands for Locally Owned and Import Substituting Development. And the concepts of LOIS are very much rooted in the work and ideas of Jane Jacobs. Local ownership, we know what it means. It means that the majority of a company is held by people living in the same place where it is principally doing business. Import substitution is a fancy way of saying focus on local markets first, because self-reliance is the basis for a powerful economy. Now, there is a mountain of evidence that has emerged in recent years about the superiority of this new form of economic development to the old form. We know, for example, that the cost of a job through LOIS can be a couple of $1,000s of public or outside money, whereas the cost of a job through this sort of traditional method that I call TINA, for there is no alternative to the global economy, is often tens of thousands of dollars a job, or hundreds of thousands, or in a few pathetic instances, millions of dollars per job. We know that locally owned businesses tend to be associated with entrepreneurship, with tourism, with higher degrees of civil society, with greater degrees of political participation, with smart growth. We also know, and this is the most important point, that when you have 2 comparable businesses, a local business and a non-local business, that the local business, when you put money into it, it spends more of the money locally. And what that means is that the local business contributes more powerfully to the economic multiplier, which is basically the fact that when I spend money at a local pharmacist, someone takes my dollar to a local supermarket, and the person there maybe spends $1 with a local farmer. So we have a dollar that circulates in the economy, and the more times this dollar circulates and the faster it circulates, the more income, wealth, and jobs. And what we know from about 25 studies that have been done in the US and internationally, that a dollar spent at a locally owned business will generate 2 to 4 times as much income, wealth, jobs, tax receipts, and charitable contributions as a dollar spent at a non-local business. In fact, the data are now so overwhelming that these studies have become boring, and there's not a single study to show to the contrary. So in a way, the verdict is in about what leads to economic development, and we know that economic development is not focusing on it. The good news is that you folks here in Vermont, not everywhere, not consistently, but by and large, have embraced this local business paradigm of economic development more consistently and coherently than most of the other states in the United States. And I think this is one of the reasons why your unemployment rate, happily, has been much more modest than it has been in much of the rest of the country. Now, really, the only objection that I get to the local business paradigm is people who say, well, local businesses just are not as competitive as non-local businesses. And last night I went through a bunch of pieces of analysis to show how silly these arguments are. But just a couple of important points. One is that if you look at 1,100 sectors in the North American Industrial Classification System and ask the question, in how many of these 1,100 categories do we have more examples of successful large business than small business, the answer is 7. That is, in 1,093 categories, we have more examples of competitive small-scale business. So we know how to do small-scale very effectively in almost every nook and cranny in the economy. Second point, if it were true that local businesses were less competitive, we, over the last 25 years of globalization, would have seen a steady drift of jobs in this country from the local business sector to the non-local business sector. And in fact, the drift has been in the other direction. The local business sector, if you add in home-based businesses, has actually been slightly gaining more jobs as a percentage of the whole economy, gone from about 53% to 54, 55%. So the last point is in terms of profitability. If you pull out your statistical abstract, what you find is that sole proprietorships are about 3 times more profitable per unit of business, per unit of sales, as are C corporations, which begins to suggest the competitiveness of local small businesses. And if you think they're competitive now, wait till you see what happens when you get to $200 or $300 a barrel oil. All this junk that we are importing from China is no longer going to be cost effective to bring here, even if the price of labor were 0, which it practically is, because the transportation costs are going to outswamp any labor advantage from doing things overseas. So if we're open to it, if we're prepared to it, localization means embracing the sort of comeback of a lot of manufacturing that's going to be more cost effective to do at home. There are a bunch of obstacles that face localization, but perhaps the most important, in my view, is investment. Right now, we have a rather silly organization of finance. And I'm going to do a little exercise that I did last night, but just to make a point. By show of hands, how many people do their banking at a local bank or credit union? All right, so you see the kind of crowd we're in. By show of hands, how many people have your pension funds in local business? Oh, one person back there. We'll talk to him afterwards. Now this is quite extraordinary because half of the economy, slightly more than half of the economy, is local small business, and I just showed you that it's highly competitive and profitable, and yet none of our long-term capital, which totals about $26 trillion, is going into local small business. This is a fundamental market failure. And correcting this market failure by creating new mechanisms that allow people to put their long-term capital into local businesses is a key part to sort of unleashing the localization revolution. This is beginning to happen. My next book, which is out at the end of this year, tentatively titled A Living Rate of Return, sort of documents ways that people are doing local capital investment through everything from self-directed IRAs, creative cooperative investment, the emergence of local stock markets, and new interesting small-scale revolving loan funds. But where I want to sort of take this conversation is a broader picture of what a to-do list around this agenda looks like. Because even though you're doing better than much of the country when it comes to unemployment, you're not doing great. Because there still are, in this county, about 1,300 people unemployed. And if we look regionally, this county and Bennington County, it's about double that number. Now, all of you have gotten these handouts here, which is sort of just a quick summary of some observations about your economy. And what I did is I put together numbers from both Bennington and Windham counties so we could have a little bit of a regional glimpse here. And on the first page, what you can see is that we have a total of about 38,000 people. And this was at the end of 2008. We have about 8,500 self-employed individuals. And those of you who were with us earlier today and last night, all the numbers I went through then were just Windham County. So that's why these numbers are different. This is a two-county region. So the numbers here are larger. And then the third category is from a tool that I created on the website of my employer, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, that estimates how many jobs you could have that you don't have right now if you were to meet local demand with local business. Now, it's not saying that all of these businesses are feasible. You know, this is where an analyst has to come in and sort of reality test these numbers. But I think the fact that one can locate at least 18,800 jobs that plausibly could be created around local demand in this two-county area suggests that even if you got 1/10 of those numbers through increased local business, it would be enough to meet your unemployment problem right now. Hopefully you could do a lot better than that. One of the things that I went through last night is a kind of 6P approach to fixing the problems of our economy right now. And the P's are planning, people, partnerships, purchasing, and public policy. And broadly speaking, the planning piece is trying to identify leaks in your economy. Where are all those places where you are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services and looking for opportunities for import substitution, part of the lowest thinking. The people piece is training up a new generation of lowest entrepreneurs to staff these businesses, lead these businesses. The partnership piece is building relationships among local businesses, like local business alliances, that allow participants to be more competitive together than they ever would be if they just remained as individual entrepreneurs. So an example would be like a purchasing cooperative among a bunch of local businesses as a way of lowering the cost of production. PERS is trying to figure out ways of tapping into those pension funds and bringing them into the community here. Purchasing our local first campaigns, buy local campaigns. And to me, one of the remarkable things in economic development is the avoidance of discussion of buy local, even though this is a home run for supporting local businesses, because they're so fixated in that global paradigm that the idea that you would favor local businesses seems unconscionable. But in fact, we know that when people buy local, it stimulates the economy. Finally, public policy, and my view about public policy is a very simple one, that economic development programs should stop favoring non-local business. And other kinds of public policy should stop favoring non-local business, like securities laws or like procurement law. And if we could level the marketplace local businesses, I believe, will receive a serious renaissance. Now, to sort of just give you a sense of what that renaissance could be, I want to kind of show you a couple of other things on these pages that I've handed out. So on page 2, so Bali has a couple of different calculators, and so we did some other calculations here. One is on food. And what you can see when you put the two counties together is that you guys are, produce more than all the dairy products that you consume. No surprise there. You're producing about half the fruit that you consume, a third of the vegetables that you consume. But my favorite one in here is chicken, poultry. You produce 3% of the chicken that you consume. There is a business opportunity in this region for more than 2 million chickens a year to be raised and processed. Page 3, the financial leakage calculator. Thank you. Page 3 takes national data about different kinds of short-term and long-term savings and adjusts them to your population. And, just with that simple exercise, we can say that there's, just in this two-county area, $9 billion of potentially investable private capital. $9 billion. If half of that money were to shift to local business, that would be $4.5 billion. Now, I suggest to you that there are some interesting business opportunities that would come to the table if $4.5 billion started to be available for the seeding or expansion of the new generation of local businesses. The last page, page 4, gets into a topic which I'm going to end on, which is this concept of meta business. One of my many frustrations with the way that economic development is currently organized is that the profession that is supporting entrepreneurship is itself not particularly entrepreneurial. That is, they go to government or foundations year in, year out for chunks of money, and they're not earning their own keep. And I actually think that we should demand that economic development pay its own way. How would economic development pay its own way? Well, we start conceiving of economic development not as something that government gives us, but something we do for ourselves. And we create business structures around economic development to deliver the things that I just mentioned to you, the entrepreneurship, the partnerships, the local investment, and the local purchasing. So, rather than having a money-losing incubator, business incubator, figure out a structure for business incubators where the incubated businesses pay back the incubator, and it actually perhaps becomes a profit stream. Rather than building, a for-profit partnership organization among local businesses, we could create, say, a local delivery system that makes money for all of these businesses. Rather than encouraging people to invest local, we create here a local stock market. And through fees and various other kinds of technical assistance that one offers in a local stock market, we can make this entity pay for itself. Rather than promoting buy local campaigns that just cost money to do, we could create something like a local gift card that would be a money-making device that would help to expose people and push people toward locally owned businesses. So that's the broad framework for meta businesses. And this morning, if any of you are interested, I think it was filmed, I went through about 15 meta business ideas in some detail. But I think what I would like to do is just pause here and then invite my fellow panelists to come on up and share some of their thinking about how these localization ideas resonate in their own little piece of the universe, and we'll open it up for a broader discussion. So thanks for this opportunity to give an opening set of remarks.
you, Michael. So I'd like to invite Jeff Lewis, Chris Campany, Vern Rubinger, and Danny Lichtenfeld to join me on the panel. I'm just going to make some brief introductory remarks, and you'll recognize that I've squeezed your bios even more, as usual. Michael, are we going to have you? Do you want to pull up a chair?
Sure. I see one here.
I'm gonna,
You can be the center and star.
yeah, I'm gonna join you. His organization is the Economic Development. He is the Economic Development Director for the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and author of The Smart Mart Revolution: How Local Businesses Are Beating the Global Competition. Jeff Lewis is the Executive Director of the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. He has taught classes at the School for International Training Graduate Institute and Marlborough College Graduate Center and serves on a number of boards. Chris Campany has come to the Wyndham Regional Commission as Executive Director in August 2010. He was previously Assistant Professor for Landscape Architecture at Mississippi State University and Deputy Director of Planning and Zoning for Calvert County, Maryland. Vern Rubinger is Adjunct Professor at the University of Vermont Extension Service, based here in Brattleboro, where he coordinates the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program of USDA, and very well-known person in our attempts to create local food systems. Danny Lichtenfeld, I didn't do this in the right order, so I suppose I should have asked you to raise your hand. When you speak, say your name again. Danny, at the far right, is the director of the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center, which has greatly expanded under his leadership, and especially in community-based programs, but also creating a regional and national reputation. And he was previously at Yellow Barn in Putney, where he also led that organization's expansion. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ellen McCulloch Lovell. I'm ending my 7th year as president of Marlborough College and its graduate school. Very happily back in Vermont after 21 years in Washington, D.C., working in cultural policy, politics, and public policy. And before that, I spent 13 years at the Vermont Arts Council. I think my related experience to today's discussion is in the creative economy and the nonprofit sector. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to start us off. Each panelist has been asked to make really brief remarks, and so I'm tough. So if you go over 5 minutes, I'll ask you to wrap up, because we want to leave time for some responses from Michael and your remarks and questions. And I guess I'll just stay here and preside from the podium. Jeff?
Thank you, Ellen. Can you all hear?
No.
Yes.
You can. We can yell louder, or we can even stand up. How's that? I am Jeff Lewis. I'm the Regional Economic Development person. We run BDCC, the Economic Development Agency. And I appreciate Michael's comments about economic development. I want to make clear that we are the host to 125 small local companies in our buildings. So we, in fact, do exactly what he's described already. Unfortunately, we're also the largest commercial landlord in Brattleboro, which is a bad thing. You don't want your economic development agency to be your largest landlord. You really would like that to be a commercially viable venture. It isn't. So that's something to learn. Second, on the unemployment front, just to give a little bit of color to the analysis, frequently we run across people saying, gosh, you're doing great down there in southeastern Vermont because your unemployment rate is just really low. Before the recent crisis, it was 3.5%. That's because for the last 20 years, we have been bleeding jobs in workforce. So we have fewer jobs now than we did 20 years ago. We have fewer workers. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. So the unemployment rate in our case is what we call a negative artifact. That is, it's telling us something that is just flat not true. So you can get into some details about who's not working, and then there's some material in there, and who's underemployed, of which we have quite a few. I think some of you are probably part of them who are more educated than the job you have more talent or other means, and you can't find a job that matches that. So we have a lot of that. At the same time, with the rising poverty rate, we have a number of people who are unemployable. So we have an increasingly complex employment mix here that really is part of our challenge. So those are a couple of things. Finally, because I know Ellen's going to cut me off, I do want to say that any discussion like this about the nature of the economy is incredibly valuable. People have not, for years, paid attention to what the economy ought to feel and look like. The more we can have that public discussion, the better. There's this group, Transition Putney. There's a group I'm involved with, the Southeastern Vermont Economic Development Strategy Group, which is equally addressing the economy, trying to build an asset-based strategy. This kind of discussion is clearly part of that because you all are participants in this economy. So we're trying to do in Windham County, I think, what Michael's described. So, but it's a long road up from where we've been.
Thank you.
Did I meet the time?
Yes, excellent. You are a role model. I'm going to turn to Chris next because I think you also have an overview on the county from your standpoint at the Windham Regional Commission.
Yeah, I could sit or stand as you prefer. I've been here since August, and I'm still getting to know the territory. Much of what I've learned about the economy of the region, I've learned through the participation of the Southeast Vermont Economic Development Strategy, which is being coordinated by the BDCC and chaired by Barb Sontag, town manager of Brattleboro. And I wrote down some of my impressions of strengths, challenges, and opportunities, and the roles potentially that the Windham Regional Commission can play. For those of you who don't know, we coordinate planning among 27 towns in Windham, bits of Bennington, and Windsor County. And relative to most states, planning in Vermont is rather decentralized. And that has strengths, has definite strengths because it is very localized. It also has some weaknesses in that it can be challenging to develop economies of scale around some things that, especially like infrastructure investments and those kinds of things. But some strengths, quality of place, both the built and natural environment here is incredible. Our villages are remarkably intact. Sprawl has generally been kept to a minimum with some exceptions, and that has an impact both on quality of place but also on infrastructure investments that have to be made well into the future. The people here are generally quite welcoming. We have an abundance of cultural resources, which also contributes to that quality of life. Rural livability here is quite good. I grew up in southwestern Virginia, and in southwestern Virginia, you look on a map, you see a small town. You get there, you think there might be a place to get food, get gas, get basic services. No, that's been hollowed out a long time ago. In Vermont, that's not necessarily the case. It's much more livable. Accessibility of natural resources, the ethic here about generally letting people onto your land is good. Large number of independently owned and operated businesses. There's something here that encourages entrepreneurship. And because of that competition, quality tends to remain quite high, thereby reinforcing the Vermont brand. Challenges, organization around economic development initiatives. Most parts of the country, when you talk about planning, when you talk about even governance, so much of it is around economic development. Not here. We seem to be organized around everything except economic development. And to the extent we are, it's rather stovepiped. That's just and to that end, I don't really get a sense of urgency here that I've felt in other places where I've been. There's hidden poverty and social problems, which I believe the Windham Regional Commission is perhaps in a fairly unique position to help give more light to, even using tools like geographic information systems and mapping. Where is this? Elevate the presence of it so that we begin to address it on a more aggressive basis. There seems to be substantial wage and employment insecurity. Generally speaking here, you lose your job, you're going someplace else. you're probably not able to stay here because the jobs, quite frankly, aren't here to fill, unless you're able to tack together several different jobs, which I know is a bit of a pattern. We have relatively high taxes in our population centers, Brattleboro and Bellows Falls. The population has generally increased in some of our more rural towns. Probably the reason is it's very difficult to afford even an entry-level home in our major population centers, because then you've got the taxes on top of that, and if you're smart, you probably don't necessarily want to bank on homestead exemption always being there. We have disproportionate numbers of people employed in relatively low-paying service industries. Our youth are profoundly unemployed, and therefore they leave. Opportunities, there is wealth, as you noted. How do we get that invested here locally? There are these international connections here that we have. I know this kind of flies in the face of local focus, but there is this international, there are these international connections that we may be able to tap into. We have proximity to large population centers, which raises an interesting question since we're talking about transition Putney. In a steady state economy, what do you do with a region and a state that's largely dependent upon exports and tourism? We're talking about a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. We also probably need to keep in mind that our population here only got back up to its highest levels of which we achieved in the early 1830s in the 1990s. If you look at what Vermont looked like in the 1830s and 40s, you wouldn't have wanted to live here. It was denuded. We had sheep everywhere. We had destroyed our streams. We had destroyed our rivers. Probably not necessarily where we want to go back to. So just something to keep in mind that, if we talk about a steady state economy, kind of a post-oil economy, what does Vermont look like? It's probably going to look very different than what we're talking about now. So it's nice to talk about that in theory, but it's going to cause some major cultural shifts on the way there. I guess I'm probably out of time.
We're out of time.
So anyway, I'm happy to talk about more regional planning commission roles in the discussion.
Yeah, I hope we'll bring that out, Chris, and sometime we'll have a cup of coffee and explore what you meant by Vermont being generally quite welcoming. Dan, may I call on you for another local and regional perspective in the arts and culture?
Sure. I'm Danny Lichtenfeld, Director of the Brattleboro Museum and Arts Center. Thank you, Transition Putney, Paul and John and others for bringing Michael here, and Ellen and Marlboro for hosting this morning's event. And thanks, Michael, for spending some time in Southern Vermont. Everything you say is too interesting and loaded, and hard to process. It all. I get asked. I get invited to speak, not infrequently at events that one way or another are looking at the question of the arts and the economy and the creative economy. And I'm happy to do that, and I feel a little bit unqualified to do that very well. I don't understand economics very well. But I always feel like I want to remind myself and remind everyone in the audience that the principal reasons that the arts are important and that many of us are engaged in the arts for one reason or another are not necessarily economic. And there are economic benefits to what we're doing, and it's intriguing and important for us to explore the ways in which we can contribute even more vitally to the economy. But the real reason that we're doing what we're doing as artists and arts organizations is for things like developing self-esteem among children and an understanding of the world around us and how to work with each other, and inspiration and other quality of life issues. And I always feel like I need to remind myself of that, and maybe remind others of that when the focus becomes about arts and how arts contribute to the economy. That said, most of my time spent next door at the museum, I'm in my office, I'm at my computer, and the fact that what we're doing has to do with art has nothing to do with my daily life, which is a lot more like running a small business. And most of the arts organizations here in our area are a lot like small businesses and are contributing and play a role in the economy and are contributing to the economy very similarly to for-profit small businesses. I think hearing one of the points that Michael made about certain types of dollars that get spent in such a way that lend themselves to circulating around in the economy, and that's a good dollar circulating around versus dollars that are going elsewhere. I think that probably is characteristic of dollars spent at our local arts organizations more so than some other types of sectors, because we know how to do things, not that other sectors and other industries don't. But we have, the arts organizations in general, and in particular in this region, have a tradition and a history, and built into their fabric of being how to stretch a dollar and get as much done with that dollar as you possibly can. And by and large, what that means is that our dollars are being spent on personnel who are working long hours, and not a lot on stuff. And so those dollars that are being spent at the museum by visitors coming to the museum or donations coming into the museum, those are largely paying people who work at the museum, who live here locally, and then are spending their money to support their life and their lifestyle here locally. I was sitting here trying to think, can I think of any significant expenses that we as the museum have where we're sending our dollars out of the community, and I can't. I mean, to the extent that we do inevitably have some expenses where we need to buy goods and materials and engage outside services, we do almost all of that within our local or regional economy here. And I suspect that that's true of all the arts organizations in the area. I want to just tell you about one program that we have, a relatively new program that we have going at the museum, because it feels to me like it's a possible model for doing things in the vein that we're here thinking about today and talking about today. I don't know exactly what it would take to scale it up or how far it could go, but it's been very well received so far. So we're doing something called Bean Dinners, Bean Microgrant Dinners, where Bean is an acronym, B-E-A-N, and it stands for Brattleboro Essential Arts Network. This is a partnership between the museum and the Elliott Street Cafe. And what happens is, once every few months, we host a dinner that is catered and served by the Elliott Street Cafe. We host it at the museum. And prior to the dinner, we have invited local artists or non-artists or businesses, anyone locally who has a project, an art-oriented project, that would benefit the community somehow and could use a few $100s to get off the ground, to submit a very simple proposal for what your project is, for your funding request. And the dinner is open to the general public, and people pay $10 to come to dinner, this wonderful Mexican dinner served by the Elliott Street Cafe. And whoever shows up for dinner that night looks through all the proposals and discusses them and decides which ones they like best, and the proceeds, everybody's $10 that they paid to come to dinner, the proceeds are then given out to the proposals that the group democratically voted on and liked best. We thought when we started this, we've done 2 of these so far, and our next one is in May. We anticipated that we would, and we sort of planned for about 10 proposals and 30 dinner guests. And so we said, you should submit proposals that would really benefit from a micro grant of maybe $300. But 80 people showed up for the first dinner. We had and there were 30 proposals. And we had $800 to give out. And the first decision the group made was not to give out one grant of $800, but since the proposals were geared toward even smaller grants in the first place, let's give out 3 grants of $300 each. And then the second one was just as well attended, and our next one's in May. So we're excited about it, and other communities have been taking notice and asking us to come talk with them about how this works. And we didn't make it up. There are programs like this happening elsewhere around the country, but it's something that's working well for us, and I think it obviously resonates in this community, and wondering about how it can be, if there's a possibility for scaling it up. So there you have it.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, very good example. I'm going to ask Vern to be next with another kind of culture, agriculture.
Okay.
And I think you've got both a regional and a statewide perspective.
Right. I've been working with Extension for 20 years around Vermont, and I work with a grants organization that covers the whole Northeast. And I think, as you all are well aware, there's something magical happening around food and agriculture, a renaissance, a revolution, and this particular area is really well suited to participate in that. We have a reasonable amount of land suited to production. We've got an incredibly engaged consumer base. We've got a lot of new young farmers from both on the farm, from out of the region coming in, without which we'd be dead in the water. That's really a remarkable asset. And we've got a variety of receptive markets. Across the region, the direct markets has been where most of the action has been at. Tremendous growth in farmers markets, CSAs, roadside stands, even online. Kind of the flip side of that is that's a very limited part of our overall food consumption. And although that may grow, even double, triple, really there's a lot of talk around the country about scaling up local food, how to get into institutional markets, how to get into wholesale, how to work with the co-ops who are receptive, but even they're challenged when a major supplier is a United Foods or something, so sourcing food from around the world, really, and the supermarkets even more so, owned by multinationals and talking the local talk, but the question is, will they really walk the walk when push comes to shove? How committed are they to the economic viability of small farms in the neighborhood? And I think, responding to some of what you said about these, the robust nature of local business and investment, so much of it seems to be about relationships. So there's a reason why the philanthropy goes up, because it's your neighbors and you see what's happening. So it's the same thing when we look at institutional markets. When the local hospital is buying, the likelihood that they're going to turn out a dime and say, oh, that was good for a while, we're done, is a lot lower than a Walmart or a Whole Foods, who something could change and they don't know. The buyers are far away. They don't know these people. They don't drive by their places of production. So emphasizing the importance of that relationship as the foundation for the local food helps in a lot of ways, but also helps with this issue that the commodity food system externalizes its costs. I mean, anyone who's seen Food Inc. knows this. We're not paying for the labor, we're not paying for the water, we're not paying for the highway system, so that's why there's no chicken produced here hardly, because you can't make chicken for $1.99 a pound in southern Vermont. So there's two things that need to be attacked. One would be laying bare that those mistruths, that's really cheap chicken, that we really are paying for it in other ways. And the other thing would be talking about the externalized benefits that our local food system could provide that we don't talk about. So what is the economic impact of kids being healthier because they eat more fresh local food, because they connected to the farms and they have lower healthcare costs? We don't have a good way to put a price tag on that when we're talking to the non-converted, to say there's a real economic value in this kind of system. The same thing, what's tourism? $2 to $4 billion in the state. So there's been one or two small attempts to quantify, what does that mean as far as those dollars in Vermont that people drive by these working landscapes and see forests and fields and farms. There's real money there. It's just we don't know how to say that. And it would make it easier for people to say, oh, that chicken costs 25 cents or $1 a pound more, but I know I'm investing in things that I really care about. It's been made clear to me. I think a lot of us now sort of intuitively know it, and we intuitively know the food's better for us. And then there's the whole culinary aspect. Yeah, a lot of the cheese movement in Vermont, for example, is that there really is a quality difference. It tastes better. The connoisseurs see that and are willing to pay for it. So I see this as a huge challenge on both ends to own up to that the food we're competing against isn't really cheap. Now, when people are buying unlimited budget, that's not a good argument. But we don't need everybody. That's the whole other question I have. The average expenditure is very small on local foods in Vermont, even though we're leading the nation. Depends on what number you look at, $40, $50, $60 per year. I mean, if we got another 10% of the people committed to buying local, that could create a huge amount of market to start to ramp up. And the other piece that's become really clear with this whole farm-to-plate study, that we have a statewide program funded by the legislature to have a 10-year strategic plan, and one of their goals is to double local food consumption, is that it's about a lot more than agriculture. We really have to think about food system, and that means not just the people that grow it, the processors, the retailers, the people that add value and turn it into products, the kids that eat it and their health, the people who service all of the equipment, and the truckers that take stuff and the slaughterhouse. And suddenly you're looking at a quarter or third of the economy in terms of jobs and people and income. And that's a transformative thing, because ag has tended to be very, insular. Like, if you're not a farmer, you're not part of ag. And that we've really shot ourselves in the foot, because we end up with the lowest possible economic evaluation of the food. And it's actually, the production piece is quite small, but it gets magnified up the chain. So we need to start expressing that too. When you buy this product, look at all of this other economic activity that you have supported that's coming back to your community. And so that's something we're struggling to do now. Some of the stuff, sense of place, we'll probably never quantify, but there are a lot of other things that we need help from a new breed of economists to put a value on. And the last thing I'll just say is, success breeds failure sometimes. We've seen this sort of in organic. It was so successful, corporations move in, and you get confinement dairies selling cheap organic milk up against local organic. The average consumer can't tell the difference. They don't know what they're buying. And we're seeing the first wave of that in local food. Lay's potato chips, brought to you by your local potato farmer. Guess what? Potato farms in Idaho, they're nice guys, but they've got, some of them have 50,000 acres of potatoes, 100,000. It's good for that, but that's not a local potato, I'm sorry. But how do you know that when it says on the label? Local potatoes. So we're going to have to find a way to retain the authenticity of the local food movement, and that without that, it'll just get taken over.
Thanks, John. I see a lot of heads nodding. I can't resist saying that we were very proud to attract the Organic Trade Association to the Marlborough College Graduate Center, which is the whole building, with the strong support of the state of Vermont. I think you were involved with that too, weren't you? I see you with it. I saw one of the Alden brothers. And I wanted to add a comment, your comment about agriculture and tourism. A former head of economic development and tourism for the state of Vermont once said to me, when I was pushing arts and tourism, he was talking about the land and the sense of place, and he said, if we didn't have the little black and white cows on the hillside, we'd have to put them there. I'm going to change the subject and talk briefly about the contributions of education and the nonprofit sector to our area economy before we go back to Michael. And I want to thank Jeff Lewis for some numbers that I'm going to start with. They really come directly from him, where we have about 43,000 jobs.
43,000 people,
People.
23,000.
Sorry, we have 43,000 people and 23,000 jobs in the county. 6 of the top 10 employers are nonprofit organizations. And they are 3 hospitals, Marlborough College, SIT, the School for International Training, which is part of World Learning, and Landmark College. And these account for 2,200 jobs out of that 23,000. Jeff notes that they are indeed high-quality jobs with benefits and stability and good pay and institutional longevity. Now, let's look quickly at the whole nonprofit sector. The educational institutions and the nonprofit health organizations are part of a very, very large and robust nonprofit sector in Vermont. And one of the points I want to make is how much the state of Vermont and all forms of local government and we as citizens depend on our nonprofit organizations for the delivery of many, many, many services, whether it's in agriculture or the environment or the arts and culture or social services or services for youth or education. Altogether, the nonprofit sector comprises 18.7% of the state's domestic product. That's up from 11% when the last survey was done, I think in 2002. It's really a huge number. And it is especially in contrast to the fact that there is almost no public policy directed at the nonprofit sector as a sector, directed at its health and its needs and its employment, except for one major public policy, which is tax exemption. And even that is under threat in many, many areas. There are over 4,000 nonprofit organizations in the state, and together their revenues top $4 billion. If we look at the county, now I want to say I'm quoting a wonderful recent study by the Vermont Community Foundation. The updated and older study that had been much relied on and have come out with some really reliable data, and I commend this to you, all of you. Vermont Community Foundation, it's on their website, and it's called Vermont's Nonprofit Sector, very prosaically. So now let's look at the county. The county has 424 nonprofit organizations, and they have total revenues of $371 million. Neither Jeff nor I have been able to get our hands on the employment figure because, again, you know, if you look at research and our economic development professionals, Michael, they don't look at things this way. This is a cross-section, and I think an extremely, extremely useful one. Looking specifically at education in the county, I did kind of my own survey, and I looked at Marlboro, Landmark, SIT, Union Institute and University, which has a small program in this building, and Community College of Vermont, and found that together we employ, and I think this is low, I came up with 525 people. Jeff and I were chatting earlier, and we think maybe we
I
missed.
think she's understating it a little bit. I think it's actually higher than that.
The first three, Marlboro, Landmark, and SIT, together pay over $27 million in wages and benefits to our employees. I'll end my brief remarks by saying that from my perspective, looking at 7 years of bright, eager young people going through our undergraduate program, I see that many of them want to stay in the state. So we know that youth are leaving for education and jobs. We're also, I think a recent study showed that Vermont's educational institutions are attracting more students than leave. If we could capture some of that talent, that would be a great benefit. There is a new back to the land movement. They are extremely interested in the relationships between food, economy, culture, anthropology, place. They are looking very, very broadly at their roles.
So does this mean you're starting a farm at Marlboro College?
Yes. and consuming more local food and our own food, we hope. If we could, you know, get past the misshapen carrot phase. They're also, these young people are willing to be artists in a cultural economy that does not guarantee them anything. They want to be artists without the grants and without any assurance of an economy, out of their understanding about the role of imagination in society and creativity in society. And at least talking about Marlboro undergraduates specifically, over a quarter of them become teachers. So there is very much the spirit of passing on to the next generation and wanting to inspire the next generation. I was recently at the National Science Foundation with a group of artists and scientists. This was a meeting organized by NSF and the National Endowment for the Arts, Marlboro College, and the University of Montana. We put together about 26 artists and scientists, life scientists. And I was very struck when the scientists called on the artists to supply the imagination that is going to help the scientists create the solutions to our future problems. Stuart Kaufman, the evolutionary biologist and MacArthur Genius Award winner, used Anton Chekhov's phrase in asking the artists to re-enchant the world. With that, I'll bring back Michael to re-enchant us. And Michael, we're just running about 10 minutes late, so I'm going to ask you to keep your responses to about 10 minutes, if you have 10 minutes worth of responses.
Yeah, maybe a
And
little.
then I'll come back and take some Q&A. Okay, great.
Maybe I'll just go here. So these are, fascinating remarks. And one of the things that's interesting about it is how different some of these comments, not inconsistent, but different from the groups of people that we engaged with earlier today in Putney. I scribbled out a bunch of things that I thought were just interesting points to flag that we won't thoroughly converse with here, but I think over time these are things that you ought to be looking at. One thing that Jeff said that I think is really interesting and important is that he said, irrespective of the unemployment rate being relatively low, remember that many people who have jobs could be doing more, and many people who don't have jobs aren't going to get them. And actually, those cautions are things that I hear all over the country. It has been done relatively well. And I would argue that that something done relatively well is the embrace of a lot of local businesses, a lot of home-based businesses, and as we heard, nonprofits. The typical component of nonprofit production in the U.S. economy is 6%. So an 18% rate, 18.7% is extraordinary, and maybe does tell you something very powerful. Because nonprofits, almost by definition, don't move. They have no plans for going to Mexico and Malaysia for higher wages. At least, maybe you have other plans you want to share with us. I want to talk about a couple of points that Chris raised, because he raised, I think, very common concerns that people have about localization, and I think this is kind of a useful place to say that there's many different conceptions of localization out there, and if I can be so crude and self-serving as to say that a dumb way to localize is to become self-reliant and cut yourself off from the rest of the world. Okay? I think a smart way to localize is you become as self-reliant in the things that you can do for yourself, and that gives you the wealth to then buy the things that you can't do for yourself. So I'll just put it in very personal terms. The most powerful act of localization that I've done in the last 10 years is move my mortgage from Bankasur of America into a credit union. And that saved me several $1,000s a year. So what do I do with those several $1,000s? Well, some of that I spend locally, but some of it I spend on Scotch malt whiskey. So I've moved from something that DC can do very well, mortgages and credit unions, and now we do that. And now there's something we can't do very well, which is malt whiskey. And so localization is about helping communities everywhere become wealthier through self-reliance. And the irony is that in a localized planet where every community becomes more self-reliant and has more money, we may actually see more trade. But here's the caveat. Trade will be a smaller percentage of our total economy, even though the value of trade will go up. And people make a mistake in assuming the economy is a zero-sum game. But when you do more for yourself and become wealthier and help other people do the same, there is the ability to grow the overall global economy. That's why I have no problem with a vision of localization that is rooted in local businesses engaging in exports. And that's the way you can have sort of both ends. So there's nothing wrong with exports. The problem is unnecessary imports. That's what you want to get away from and what is damaging our economies right now. I also would say, I part company with a lot of my brethren in the transition movement, because I embrace economic growth. I'm not a steady state person, except with respect to, I think you can have economic growth and a steady state of the environment by having growth in things like information, technology, smarter ways of doing things, being more efficient. And if we can do those things and steadily reduce the amount of energy we consume per dollar of gross domestic product, the amount of material throughput that we use, especially of non-renewable materials, the amount of pollution we're throwing out, I think we can see a lot of additional growth without having additional growth of energy or additional growth of material use. Danny, I love Danny's bean dinner idea. I used to organize in Washington something called the Breakfast Club, where once a month I would make waffles and coffee for people, and our mailing list grew to about 600 people. And fortunately, they all didn't show up at the same time in my little house, except once. But I would suggest that this gathering, you're aiming far too low. Okay, your aim should not be $200-300 grants. Your aim should be tens of thousands of dollars of investment money that you're going to capture with these people. And earlier, I gave the example of a small group of people, very similar to your group, called LION, the Local Investment Opportunities Network in Port Townsend, Washington. And it's about 50 people. Most of them are not very wealthy, but they circulate business plans among the folks in the group. And, you know, if someone sees a business plan they like, they make the relationship, and one-on-one they go off and they do a loan, and they have created literally millions of dollars of deals with people who are not millionaires. And I think that is the kind of next step that I would love to see Bean going into. I love local food, and Vern gave, I think, a great sense of what's going on here. Last year I was here for a presentation at UVM, and someone presented some data that showed, I don't know if this is still true, but when you look at the percentage of produce that is sold by direct marketing, Vermont was so far ahead per capita of every other state in the country. So, I mean, something has taken hold here that, the rest of the country has sort of fallen behind on. I certainly agree with what he said, that the big challenge now that everyone's looking at is how do we scale up? I did a report that I encourage you all to download, it's for free, called Community Food Enterprises at, not surprisingly, www.communityfoodenterprises.org. And it was a report for the Gates Foundation where we looked at 24 examples of great local food businesses, half in the US, half internationally, and we tried to sort of show what were the techniques that they were using to scale up and to be competitive in their markets. And I think, even on something like chicken, while we didn't cover chicken per se, we did have Lawrence Meats, which is in Minnesota and is a, kind of mid-range processing company that has really shown how you take a very large-scale business of meat processing and bring it to that middle scale and be cost-effective. I agree that we're never going to get local chicken to be as cheap as bionic chicken that you could buy at Safeway right now. But the good news is that bionic chicken is in trouble. As oil prices rise, bionic chicken is going to become a lot more expensive. If we ever get smart about stripping subsidies on water and energy and international trade out, that bionic chicken will be more expensive still. So I still believe that there are so many inherent inefficiencies in the mainstream agriculture model that local chicken still stands a shot of getting a lot closer. And at the end of the day, and I made this point last night and earlier today, it's not what is the cheapest chicken. It's what is the best value of chicken. And educating the consumer about the difference between value and price is a critical part of how we build a local economy. Because quality is what the local economy is all about. The quality of relationships, the quality of wealth building, the quality of our schools, the quality of our environment. the quality of the creative entrepreneurs that you've heard from today. The last point, youth. I mean, you touched on education and youth, and I think young people, of course, want to stay. Who wouldn't? I want to stay. Too bad I have an airplane ticket going back. But if they're going to say we need youth enterprise, we have to figure out how to transform young people into great entrepreneurs. And we have to figure out how to start mobilizing serious capital to support young people. One thing Harvard did recently is they created a sub-fund in their endowment to support students who wanted to launch businesses just after graduation. I think, getting a consortium of universities here to put together a fund like that, supplemented with pension funds to support youth enterprise, all for the mission of anchoring people here, could be a great thing to work on. Just some thoughts.
Thank you. I have Harvard's endowment, I do that too.
Right.
Oh, what, $50 billion. It's your turn. I'm sure you've got some great questions and comments for Michael and for the panel. And I saw a hand up, I think.
Thank you.
Yes?
This question is to Michael, Chris, and it springs from Michael's observation that current incentive policy is backwards and counter to getting us where we want to go. I wondered if you could explain a little more about where there might be hope around that. But I often think, as I look at our state, how beautiful it is, how we want to keep it that way, how much of the infrastructure could it be rehabbed and lifted, preserved visually, but reconstituted in its core. And I see this in the examples in my native England of historic buildings preserved in every way you would want to, but at the same time they're made into a work or an office area that a clean firm can come into. And we have such opportunities in this state to attract those kind of firms with families who would love this environment. Our schools, for all their struggles, are still great. We have essentially great housing stock in our villages. We have buildings that are appropriate to conversion. There are, I sometimes think there's the Townsend furniture factory. They've moved on, but it's been recycled into something else. This would be a win-win if we could preserve the visual attraction of Vermont, that is why we're here and what we love about it so much. But with investment, we could make it an hospitable and an attractive place for clean industry to come. Obviously, the missing component there is means and incentive. And I wonder if you could speak in a little more detail about what it takes to get there.
Thank you.
Can I ask you just a clarifying question? By incentive, you meant how you get private investment to move into those kinds of businesses?
Well, it sounded like you said that whatever the government does in this regard is actually
Right.
counter helpful.
Including the regulatory
Yeah.
side.
Yes, private.
Yes.
I mean, could you just do a 360 around
Okay.
what incentive means in this context?
Well, I mean, so much to say on that, and so in terms of government policy, my view is that economic development should do one of three things in order to be more effective. A, there's a libertarian solution, which is just to get rid of it. Because so much of it is tilting the playing field against local business. And I'm not talking about what we heard here or necessarily making a statement about Vermont, because I don't know your environment inside out, but I'm making a statement for what I see across the country and have empirically shown to be the case, which is a profound bias against local business. Second approach could be to reform incentives so that local business could compete equally against non-local business for any given government subsidy. So I said this last night, if government was tempted to do $100,000 a job You do a 60-day moratorium and see what local business could provide for $99,000 a job or less. And if you had a real competitive RFP process, you would never be giving that money to non-local business, I can assure you. The third approach would be to just focus it on the kinds of 6P activities that I talked about, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do real small business building. And you know, when I go around to a place like Michigan and see how many of the economic developers there are taking trips to Japan and China and Malaysia, my feeling is, let's give them a vacation for free to China and Malaysia every year, just so they can get it out of their system. And that way, when they come back, they can focus on the economic development that will be really effective. And the nice thing is that the newly elected Republican governor of Michigan has decided just about the same thing. He has pulled apart all of the big, massive recruitment programs, which decidedly were not working. But to make the next stage working, we have all these reforms that we have to do in the capital markets, in entrepreneurship support, in weaving together alliances of local businesses. So all of that is an important piece of it too. And I agree as well that the regulatory structure needs to be overhauled as well, because securities laws, which is part of the regulatory structure, is the big reason why capital doesn't go to local business right now.
Can I add something? Just
Oh,
on the
please.
regulatory. You're talking about locally, what can we do? Also, from a regulatory standpoint, you know, so often when municipalities develop zoning ordinances or bylaws, the focus is so much on what don't we want and how do we regulate it out, as opposed to how do we incentivize what we do want and really make it easier for that to come in. Because it's not this, and this is not unique to Vermont or any place. This is typical of many places. So how do you actually incentivize that? And another piece, I have an odd educational background: it's political science, public administration, and landscape architecture. And so one of the things that I always like to work with my students on when I was a professor, and that I like to work with towns on, is visualize what you want to see happen, and then work backwards from there. What does it take to get there? So we bought in the village of Newfane. So if we want to see development within Newfane, this is just a hypothetical. If you want to see more use, more investment in those structures that are already there, what does it take to do that? And then go back and look at your rules and regulations and incentives and figure out, okay, so then how do I incentivize that reinvestment in our community? It's everything from land use policy to your taxation policy. So visualize what you want. I think it needs to be steeped in reality, about what is reasonable and possible. But then walk your way back and figure out, okay, so how do we open up the doors to make that possible? So it's more positive as opposed to negative in nature.
Thanks, Chris. Question for you.
This is sort of related, and you somewhat leaned towards the answer. In the beginning, you asked two questions. Are we in local banks? All the hands went up. Where's your capital? Somewhere else. How do we change that? And you just a moment ago said that there's a lot of things in place that cause that to be true. But the question remains, how do we change that? The second aspect of this is the predominance of the nonprofit locally. Is that a distraction? Is that misdirecting capital?
You want to speak to the second question first?
I think I obviously have the point of view that these are jobs and services that if they weren't provided for, mostly through philanthropic contributions, would then either impoverish our communities or would have to be picked up by government or some kind of corporate outreach. And we know how small a part corporate philanthropy is of our total philanthropic picture. In the United States, more than 98% of philanthropy comes from individuals. And it is those generous individuals who are supporting our nonprofit sector. So Chris said imagine and then work back from it. Well, imagine a world without all the organizations that are nonprofit, service, and charitable and cultural organizations.
Yeah, it's, you know, I don't know examples of where there's been such a run on the bank of nonprofits coming for loans that it's crowded out private investors. I'm sure, you know, it could happen, but it's just hard to think of where that has happened. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. But in terms of the investment piece, it's a huge subject. I guess, you know, the shorthand I would say is that we created back in the 1930s with our securities laws a system of economic apartheid between one universe of people called accredited investors who are wealthy. They earn $200,000 a year or $300,000 as a couple, or they own more than $1 million in property. That 2% of the population is entitled to invest in anything they want to. The other 98% of us are unaccredited investors, and we cannot put our money into businesses unless these elaborate legal documents are prepared in order to make us feel more safe. Now, those documents tend to be several hundred-page booklets of single-page 8-point font in all caps, and I don't think a human being has ever been observed to be reading them. But nevertheless, this is the essence of our securities laws right now. So I mean, as a lawyer, I can tell you that it's a great growth industry for lawyers. And we've done a fabulous job of pumping up jobs for lawyers with our securities laws. But we've done nothing, I think, to enhance the safety of people because we've focused our security resources on, you know, small fish while Bernie Madoff was getting away with murder at the upper end of the spectrum. So I think the solution is that we need to deregulate the bottom of the securities pyramid and re-regulate or toughen up things at the top of the pyramid. And one way, there's a group of securities people that I work with, and we're proposing to the SEC that essentially we really federalize the security system, and that when you have a security that is issued for a local business, owned by a local individual, traded exclusively locally, the SEC really has no business getting involved, and it should be totally up to the state. So if we could get things sort of, you know, clarified that it belongs in the state, then you folks in Vermont can have some fun reorganizing your security law system to make this possible. In the meantime, there's a lot you can do. As I said, you can create a self-directed IRA. Okay, in a self-directed IRA, you basically pay someone in a bank $100 or $200 a year to serve as your trustee, and you can instruct that person to use that IRA to put money in real estate. You could put it in a co-op as a member. You could use it as a co-op loan. You could put it into, you know, a business that has gone through securities filings and will take in small-scale investing. So, you know, as we open up avenues for local investment, hopefully more and more people will use the self-directed IRA as a vehicle for putting their money into the community.
Yeah.
Commented sort of ancillary, but I think important with regard to making a real transition is that at all these different levels we're investing in things we don't believe in because the mechanisms keep it anonymous. So certainly in food, you buy stuff, you don't know where it came from, who produced it, what methods they're using, how many greenhouse gases they're generating, any of that stuff. Most of us, certainly I can speak for myself, no matter how hard you try, have a very poor grasp on what any kind of retirement funds are really supporting. You get a return, they're going off to companies, I don't know, somebody evaluates them, what are they really looking at? It worries me that I bet a lot of what I've invested in, I would pull the plug on if I could only find out. And then, you know, it goes on. Credit cards. what, $50 billion a year we give to companies to manage these things for us. You start to think about in our community, what kind of fees are we paying? You know, so we export all this money and it goes to things where we would say, if we knew, wait a minute, I don't want to spend it on that. I'd like to spend it on something that invests in something close to home that I believe in. So at least it seems like getting at that anonymity is a first step to then figuring out how do you redirect those investments.
How do you read that 6-point type?
Right.
Yeah, Jeff?
But the issue with investment, local or non-local, is risk. And the effective evaluation of risk and the tolerance and willingness to undertake that. There's a whole lot of legal stuff written around who can take what risks, assuming you're securitizing in a way that gets handled in markets. Everybody's free to do what you want with your own money. I mean, you can loan it to somebody on a personal note. You can buy a part of a company. You can say to your friend, listen, you need $50,000 for 10% of your future revenues, here's your 50. You can do that. Question is, do you really want to take that risk? Some people do because they've got enough so that 50 is a small enough portion that's a tolerable risk, or they trust their judgment, which is good, to say, that's a really good investment. But for most of us who don't have that amount of money, we need to find a way to measure the risk and in some cases mitigate it, either by spreading the investment across several small local entities and say, I'm going to share with Michael and with Vern, we're all going to put our money in a pot, and that pot is now going to buy some of this farm, some of that farm, some of that farm, some of that pottery studio. And now I've spread it using standard portfolio theory in a way that I've mitigated my risk in a reasonable way, but kept it local. So part of what we need to do is construct local institutions that can do that for us,
Right.
to do the research analysis and risk mitigation.
And Jeff and Michael, are you saying there are no such intermediary organizations that do this kind of thing? I mean, outside of
There
maybe
are a few, but
Clean
not many,
investment.
not enough, I think would be the answer. And some of them, as Michael's right, some of them are only available because they're federally chartered in one way or another to qualified investors. So what he's suggesting is interesting, is to create essentially things outside the existing regulated financial system. Bearing in mind, if you do that, you assumed a whole bunch of risk by stepping outside the existing regulated financial system. But that risk may be tolerable.
You want to comment, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there are a small number of interesting examples of pools out there. The Philadelphia Reinvestment Fund is an IRA you can put your money into, and they do revolving loans to local business, and they have a pool. And then there are, interestingly, kind of complicated co-ops with 3 or 4 different types of business. If you give, you can give multiple loans to multiple projects in your co-op, and in a funny way, you're creating a little bit of a diversified portfolio, although at the end of the day, it's still the co-op. But no, I think that the real kind of institution we're trying to create has to come in the right order. And that order, in my view, is first we create local stock for many good local companies. We make it cheaper and easier to create. We then create local stock exchanges to provide liquidity for that market. We then create diversified portfolios of those various stocks. And then finally, pension funds, publicly regulated entities will be willing to put money into those diversified portfolios. But I think we have to do it in that order.
Alex, do you want to comment on the investment opportunity you've created for the co-op?
Yeah, we were just talking about that a little while ago. We managed to collect like $1.2 million from our shareholders at our co-op for our construction project. And, we had to register that with Vermont banking and insurance or whatever that's called these days, and health and you name it. But we're not subject to SEC laws because of the way it's structured. So but we have to be very careful. It's not an investment exactly, it's a support for the co-op. So it's structured a little bit differently. So people don't put their money in there mainly just to earn money, because it's a protection against, you know, if you get delayed in paying them back or something goes wrong or something like that, they're less likely to go after you for the wrong reason. But that was a big surprise to us that we could collect that much money. I mean, we set that goal before the 2008 collapse, but we decided to keep it and see what would happen. And we set the goal of $1 million, and you know, 1.2. So that's a big part of our funding that stays right in our community. And we've already, you know, each year it's a simple interest thing. You pay the interest at the end of the year. So we've already paid the first interest payments, and it's great.
Good.
And
Thanks,
people
Greg.
really have been very excited about that.
I just wanted to give another example that I found surprising, which is cow power. In this state, you can voluntarily pay 4 cents more kilowatt hour to invest in renewable energy on farms through CDPS, and tens of thousands of people have done it. And it even says on the little disclaimer, we don't know, where the electrons go. You aren't really buying the power from these farms. You're supporting these farms. These people have never been to those farms. They don't know what an anaerobic digester is. They're investing in the concept of a local renewable source of energy. So it crosses my mind, how many other opportunities are we squandering by not offering them to people and seeing who steps forward and says, yeah, I'd like to do that. It's not, that's a very contained risk, exactly. And one other point I would make, maybe we don't have to start so big, because like we talk about this with beginning farmers, what they need is chump change. But they can't get a loan. And many of them have experience in a business plan, but they have no assets. But you're talking $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. Boy, a lot of people could afford to take that risk, but there's no vehicle for aggregating the money. And then you would need somebody, sensible with experience in that field to make the decisions. But these things are already being made, by the land trust about who gets conserved land when parcels come up for resale and things like that. So that's one thing that crosses my mind. Let's do more maybe micro lending, start a system like that, and then ramp it up. Say, wow, this thing really works. People could take a lot more risk when we find those opportunities.
If I could just add, I think the discussion about risk has to be reoriented with a kind of reality check about what actual stock markets deliver. And because we tend to have fresher and more exciting memories of good times than bads, that's part of the human condition. And I've done a careful calculation of the rate of return of 140 years of the stock market, including dividends reinvested on a monthly basis. And if you remove inflation, the rate of return is not the 7, 8, 9, or 10% that Rick Edelman brags about, but it's actually 3%. And if you retired this past year and had diligently squirreled away money for 44 years, your rate of return would have been 2.5%. If you took an average of everybody's 44-year retirement rate, it's 2.9%. If you took an average of everyone's 20-year rate, it would be 2.8%. So everything we've been told about what to expect in our retirement funds, which is shaping our perception of risk, is wrong.
The question of risk, that's return. Risk has to do, if I put all my money in one venture, if it fails, I'm toast. The question of risk is how do I spread this so that whatever the return that I've chosen that I want to try and achieve, I have some chance of making. A. B. Vern's touched on something that's extremely interesting, and I think Michael's talking about it as well. There's a growing and far more increasingly organized body of interested investors in slow money kinds of investors, lower return but socially valuable investments, local investments. This is an area of great interest. We lack, as Michael has said, on the institutions to handle this, but there are interested investors in doing that. So we don't know how to get it to the farmer yet. That's one of the problems. We don't know how to do that well. Although the Vermont Community Loan Fund, by the way, is a way that does that. People invest directly in the Community Loan Fund, accept a lower rate of return, that's their deal, and Community Loan Fund then, in turn, loans that out in small to medium-sized loans to small local businesses. So this is an established model here. Do we need more of them? Yeah. Do we need more capital in them? Yeah. Do we have to get better at choosing which farmers we want to start with? Yeah. So we got learning to do, and that's, I think, where we are.
Okay, we've got a comment over here.
To keep with this thread, though, I want to go back to the comment I think that Michael made earlier and that Vern picked up as well. There are a lot of us sitting in this room that would like to take things that we may have elsewhere and put them here. You know, so it's not the Vermont Community Loan Fund, because I can't access that. But it's another vehicle that could be some kind of dedicated fund connected with Savings and Loan, connected with River Valley Credit Union, where I could very happily put IRA funds and know that the credit union is maybe going to look exclusively, or not exclusively, but primarily at agricultural operations in our region to use those funds. That would be, how many people from Terry would that attract? It would be fabulous.
So, thank you for that. I'm going to try to engage Kate and Danny on something I noticed in your statistics, Michael. You didn't have any employment numbers for the arts sector. And
It was, I think that one was withheld.
no, there are data. I don't want to put you on the spot because I'm not sure any of us can pull it off the top of our heads. But Danny and Kate, do you want to address the employment in that sector? Or the opportunities?
I actually do have a question about that. In 2007 here, we published the economic impact of the arts in the Greater Brattleboro region. And in that there was, I think the numbers are right, 167 jobs. That could be more than 167 people, but all told 167 jobs. But to that, there were 13 volunteers per job. So what I find curious or somewhat perplexing is if those 13 people per job were employed and paying taxes, wouldn't that be a much greater benefit to the overall wealth of the community, and how to move from that statistic into something more balanced?
Well, if you wanted to generalize this, how do you move people from the informal economy into the formal economy? I think people who are participating in the formal economy have to value that activity. So I think, as more people want to be part of the arts, there's more cash flow, and presumably it will become more formalized. But there are people out there, and I think it's a very respectable opinion, who think that volunteering in and of itself, short of actually getting paid for it, is so valuable, and it connects you to your society in a certain way. And maybe you would lose some of that if it moved into the formal society. So, I think many of us are kind of mixed minds about how formal we want the arts sector to be.
Yeah, well, and I certainly don't devalue the benefit of those volunteers, because it's absolutely necessary. But what I'm saying is there is such a gap there. Wouldn't just even 10% or 20%, wouldn't that be an aim within the arts sector to?
Yeah, I mean, to turn this around as a planning objective.
Yeah.
I think doing, as you said, a 10% transformation of volunteers into paid positions in the arts to support the growth of this powerful sector of your economy would be a great thing to work on.
Danny, you want to add to anything you've heard?
I don't know that statistic that you're looking for offhand. What I do know is whatever that number is probably represents like 1.5 times that in terms of the output that's getting done by those people who work at places like New England Youth Theater and the museum and River Gallery School and elsewhere. And then to pick up on Kate's point, not to mention the fact that the collected output of these organizations, and it's not just in the arts, of course, I mean, it's throughout the nonprofit sector, certainly in social services and elsewhere, what those places are generating in terms of valuable output for the community is based on individuals working times a multiplier of themselves, plus this extraordinary number of volunteers investing their efforts. So that what we're getting for each dollar, say, that goes into one of these nonprofit organizations is just incredibly valuable in the output.
In a former life in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, organized a community food system before that was what these things were known as. And I've run into this in Baton Rouge and New York and Mississippi and Maryland, where you organize a farmer's market, and much of what makes that work is volunteer labor. But one of the issues you'll invariably run up against is when you talk to farmers about actually paying to support their own market, you meet incredible resistance. And I don't think that's unique to farmers markets. I think it's probably also true for artist collaboratives. So before we put these alternative systems on a pedestal, I think we also need to recognize we're dealing with normal human beings who tend to like to keep their money pretty tight to the vest. And one of the things that we need to do throughout this process is the people that we work with, they need to really recognize and perhaps even quantify what the value of that volunteer labor is. And I have to say that volunteer labor can manifest itself, the importance that volunteer labor can manifest itself in ways you don't expect. Like I know one of our volunteers subsequently replaced me when I moved on as director of that organization, and now he's the director of the food center in Austin, Texas. A Marlboro College graduate student who I knew in New Orleans, we volunteered together at the farmer's market there. I started the market in Baton Rouge. He became a farmer. So you never know what the volunteers in these efforts might go on to create, because the only way they can get experience is to volunteer. So there's also that incredible, there's some kind of multiplier there. Some economists has probably quantified it and evaluated all that, but volunteers really can, I don't know, they can, you can get new businesses out of them, you can get new leadership. They can become your future entrepreneurs as they learn the ropes in that low-risk environment.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to give, do you have a real quick question? Because I wanted to give Michael a couple minutes and
go ahead.
Paul and John.
No, it would take a long time.
It would take a long time? All right. Will you be sure to come forward
Sure.
after the formal part of the program? Michael, you get the last word, and I also want to invite Paul and John to make any concluding remarks they'd like.
I actually would love to hear the two questions.
All right, that's wonderful.
I think this would
Let's
be a
do
better
that.
use of time. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, second in from my left. But Chris, you had mentioned something I thought was interesting, that something here encourages entrepreneurship, and it feels to me like actually there's something here that encourages entrepreneurs to come here. And when we talk about the creative economy, I found particularly here is different than anywhere else in the country that I've been, where when they talk about the creative economy, it's not only artists, it's computer people and alternative energy people and engineers and architects. And here I actually feel like we've done ourselves a disservice, and your grad students that you say would start businesses here if we could get them going. And I feel like we do ourselves a disservice by not sort of including that entire group in the creative economy. And I know lots of people that are either architects or committed clean energy people that are all working out of their houses, all these tiny little businesses that I don't know how we would do it, and that's my question really for the panel, is how would we as a community support that piece of our economy that right now is hidden and really has nothing that I can see. And there's a great community of brain trust and commitment that basically just sort of goes, every individual is working out its own rather than creating some economy of
Good
scale.
point. Why don't you have a go at it? And there was one last question over here. Okay.
Do you want me to ask?
You want to ask yours?
Yeah, let's get it on.
I was at your session last night, and this is directed to Michael, and the issue of Vermont Yankee, our resident nuclear power plant came up. And we have locally now had more than one probably sessions on the economic impact in case that plant should close, go away, continue, all of the above. And I'm wondering, you had made a comment last night, if I remember correctly, it was sort of along the lines of it could be the best thing that ever happened to your community if it closed. I wonder if you would speak more to that in light of this conversation.
Okay, two very different kinds of questions, and about 3 minutes.
So on the kind of culture of entrepreneurship thing, this came up earlier today, and I think there is a real role for organizing seniors, retirees, to kind of systematically figure out who has what expertise, and then try to coordinate their mentoring and connecting and offering technical assistance and support for younger entrepreneurs. I think it also would be very useful to create, for want of a better word, something like a Locopedia, where you could find examples of great local businesses in the state throughout all of the NACE codes, all of the sectors of the economy. And that would then allow an entrepreneur who wanted to get involved in, say, small-scale chicken processing, say, here's someone who's been working on it. That's where I contact the person, and here's some of the things that they did in that model to make it work. Maybe this is a bigger project than just Vermont. Maybe it's a national project, but I think starting to put something together like that gives you a template to sort of systematically identify who knows what and what can they contribute to what you're trying to create. On the nuclear power front, despite all of the, there's sort of two issues here. One issue is where do we go with our energy policy, and the other issue is how do you deal with an aging dinosaur like Vermont Yankee. So the first question is an easy one in my mind, because nuclear power only exists competitively in countries that wildly subsidize it, like China and France. Every other country where nuclear power has to really compete against things, it has tripped and fallen badly. And that's why nuclear power there's been no new plant built in this country for about 30 years. About 3 years ago, the U.S. government said, we want nuclear power so bad, we're going to guarantee 80% of the plant costs with federal money. And no one stepped forward to build one. John McCain ran on his campaign, that's not good enough. We have to guarantee 100%. Well, surely, if the federal government is going to guarantee 100%, someone's going to have a taker. But this is not about an economically viable energy option. A typical nuclear power plant now is going to cost you $7 or $8 billion a plant, take 10, 15 years to build. It's an irrelevant option for what we need in the next few years. So that's why to me, that question is an easy one. On the Vermont Yankee issue, all of these nuclear plants that were designed with H-bomb technology and I'm not saying that there's the danger of their exploding like a bomb, but really this is old technology that we're just messing around with. It's like flying around in planes from the 1950s and 1960s. We've advanced, and these plants were only designed for about 40 years. And, we're just keeping it together with chewing gum right now. And I think, we just play with fire if you keep these things operating for a much longer period than they were intended for. Thinking about how you get these things offline and focus on the next generation of green energy, which is where all the excitement is in the state. It's the youth entrepreneurs you mentioned. There's lots of examples of success out there. Getting people focused on that is the right question, and wasting any time or energy on a nuclear technology whose time is gone is just a distraction.
Thank you. I'm sorry I have to bring us to a conclusion, but join me in thanking the panel, and please try to grab them after the formal part of the program.
First of all, I want to thank Ellen for your superb facilitation. It was absolutely excellent.
and thank Michael especially, and the panel, of course, and all of you for coming and engaging in this conversation. We brought Michael to Putney and to the region because we can feel in ourselves that there's a need for this kind of conversation to happen. People are really, I think, shifting the way they're thinking about and caring for their communities and their economy. And we wanted to seed Putney and seed the region with some ideas that we can take forward. Of course, it's our responsibility. Michael's not going to do it for us. We have to take hold of some of these ideas and actually make them happen. And I know in Putney we're going to have a meeting in the next couple of weeks with a group of people who heard Michael last night and today to see what are the interests. We're going to try to break this down into 1, 2, or 3 ideas, pursue those, and see if we can actually make something happen. We know that we can't do it alone. Putney is 2,600 people. We're part of a much larger region. We want to work with you to make these ideas happen and benefit all of us. So I know that there's going to be a further conversation, and I certainly want to be a part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Hair Windsor.